In January 2024, three West African governments made an announcement most people thought was a bluff. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger said they were leaving the economic community of West African states. ECOWAS had been the backbone of regional integration since 1975. Shared trade rules, shared borders, and crucially, shared security architecture tied closely to Western powers. For decades, leaving ECOWAS wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. Then, the countdown began. Over the next 12 months, the three countries moved fast and quietly. They formalized a new political bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States, known as the AES. They announced a joint defense pact, committing that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. They began issuing AES passports, replacing ECOWAS travel documents. They opened talks on new monetary and financial institutions, signaling a future outside the CFA franc system. And they reoriented their security partnerships away from France and the United States toward new actors. Then, on January 29, 2025, exactly 1 year after their announcement, it became official. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, out. Nearly half a century of regional integration severed overnight. The response from the West was immediate. The United States imposed travel restrictions on all three countries, citing failures in security cooperation. Western security briefings began using sharper language, warning that the Sahel was slipping out of the post-Cold War order that had governed Africa for decades. But here's what those responses mean. Across Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, crowds gathered, flags waved in support, speeches celebrated sovereignty. To millions across the Sahel, this wasn't isolation. It felt like independence, albeit one delayed by 60 years. And that raises the real question for us. If the AES countries are among the lowest income on earth, if they face insurgencies, sanctions, and economic pressure, why does their breakaway trigger such alarm in Western capitals? Why is a fragile alliance of Sahelian states suddenly treated as a geopolitical threat? Why is the alliance of Sahel states a threat to Western power in Africa? That's the story we're about to unpack. ECOWAS was founded in 1975. 15 member states with a shared market, a shared security framework, and for decades, the political backbone of West Africa. For most of its history, ECOWAS was treated as permanent. You could be sanctioned, suspended, punished even, but you did not leave until now. So, what happened to cause this breakaway? Well, for that, we need to rewind to January 2024. At the time, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were already outsiders. Each was ruled by a military government that had come to power through coups. Each had been sanctioned by ECOWAS. Borders closed, assets frozen, and in the case of Niger, electricity supply from Nigeria was cut. The message from regional leaders was clear: return to civilian rule or remain isolated. Then, on the same day, all three governments released a joint statement. They said they were leaving ECOWAS. The reaction at first was disbelief. Analysts called it a negotiating tactic. Diplomats described it as pressure politics. Most assumed it would quietly collapse. After all, leaving ECOWAS wasn't just symbolic. It meant losing access to regional trade preferences. It meant custom barriers, visa complications, and diplomatic isolations. For countries already among the poorest in the world, the move looked suicidal. But something was different. This time, the statement did not ask for concessions. It set a clock. You see, under ECOWAS rules, withdrawal takes 1 year. That year, from January 2024 to January 2025, became a test, not of legality, but of resolve. But instead of backing down, these three countries began building something new. First came the alliance. In September 2023, before the withdrawal announcement, The three governments had quietly signed a mutual defense pact. By 2024, it had a name, the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES. Its core promise was simple and radical. An attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. In a region shaped by coups, insurgencies, and foreign interventions, that sentence carried heavy weight, and the West reacted with alarm. Which brings us to the central question of the story. If these countries are poor, if their alliance is fragile, if their future is uncertain, why is the AES treated not as a regional experiment, but as a geopolitical threat?
Any attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of one or more of the contracted parties will be considered as an aggression against the other parties and will entail a duty of assistance and relief on the part of all parties.
To answer this question, you have to understand what existed before the AES came into the picture. This alliance didn't just fill a vacuum. It emerged into a system the West had spent decades building. On paper, the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS, is an economic bloc. Trade rules, tariffs, free movement. But beneath that economic language sat something far more important: control. Since the early 2000s, West Africa and especially the Sahel had been absorbed into Western security planning. Terrorism after 9/11 reframed the region overnight. What had once been treated as peripheral suddenly became strategic. The Sahel was labeled a frontline, and ECOWAS became the political infrastructure that made intervention legitimate. When coups happened, ECOWAS spoke first. When sanctions were imposed, ECOWAS enforced them. When military missions arrived, ECOWAS provided the regional cover. It was the gatekeeper, which meant that as long as countries remained inside ECOWAS, the West retained leverage. That leverage wasn't always visible, but it was always there. For more than a decade, Western powers treated the Sahel as a security buffer. France stationed thousands of troops across the region. The United States built drone bases and intelligence hubs. European states trained local forces there. The justification was always the same: jihadist insurgencies. Groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State were expanding. Local governments were weak. The region needed help. But over time, the results told a different story. Despite years of intervention, insecurity worsened, violence spread, civilian deaths rose, governments collapsed, and slowly the narrative shifted. Foreign troops were no longer seen as protectors. They were now seen as fixtures, permanent, unaccountable, and ineffective. The first rupture came with Mali. After a series of coups, Mali expelled French forces in 2022. At the time, Western officials framed it as reckless, but Mali didn't collapse. Instead, it reoriented. Security cooperation shifted. Command structures changed. France lost its anchor. Then came Burkina Faso. French forces forced out. Western influence reduced. And finally, Niger, the most strategically important of them all. Niger hosted key Western assets. There were drone bases, surveillance infrastructure, logistics hubs. When Niger's military government began restricting cooperation after the 2023 coup, the message was unmistakable. The platform was disappearing. Individually, these exits were troubling, but together they were destabilizing. Western sanctions are designed around isolation. One country breaks rank, pressure works. But three countries move together, the pressure weakens. The alliance of Sahel states changed the math. Borders reopened internally, trade rerouted, sanctions absorbed collectively. What had once been three vulnerable states became a bloc of more than 70 million people spanning the heart of the Sahel. Geography mattered here. The AES occupies a continuous stretch of territory from the Atlantic facing West African states to North Africa, a corridor the West had relied on for movement, access, and surveillance. That corridor was now closed, politically if not physically. But Military power wasn't the only concern. Money was. The most comprehensive and enduring instrument of French control remains the CFA franc currency system, imposed on 14 francophone African countries since 1945. For decades, the CFA franc has linked parts of West Africa to France. Supporters describe it as stability, critics describe it as extraction. Foreign reserves held abroad, monetary policy influenced externally, limited fiscal autonomy. French control extends into the governing bodies of African central banks themselves. France, you see, maintains representatives on both the boards of directors and monetary policy committees of BEAC and BCEAO, remarkably without holding any capital shares in these institutions. While no explicit veto right exists in the statutes, France can effectively block decisions through procedural mechanisms. For Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, the CFA franc system produces concrete economic damage. Capital flight becomes structurally embedded. French multinational corporations, expatriates, and local elites can repatriate profits with zero exchange risk, knowing that France guarantees convertibility. One study notes that this freedom of transfer of funds means that all economic operators doing business in the franc zone can transfer or repatriate without limits all the resulting profits, encouraging activities that extract wealth rather than building productive capacity. The system limits credit creation and economic stimulus. Just as commercial banks face reserve requirements that constrain lending, CFA franc central banks face even more severe constraints. You see, 50% of their currency reserves are locked away in Paris. By 2024, AES leaders began speaking openly about alternatives, not announcing a new currency yet, not launching a new bank, but questioning the system. And in geopolitics, questioning is often enough, because currency systems are not just economic tools, they are political ones. They decide who borrows, who controls inflation, who absorbs shocks. If the AES were to eventually leave the CFA franc system, the implications would ripple far beyond the Sahel. It would signal that monetary sovereignty, once considered too risky, was back on the table. And that precedent terrifies systems built on continuity. Then there is what lies beneath the ground. France derives approximately 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, one of the highest ratios globally. This nuclear dependence made securing uranium supplies a strategic imperative. Niger, despite being one of the world's poorest countries, possesses substantial uranium deposits that France has exploited for over 5 decades. The French state-owned company, Areva, restructured as Orano in 2018, began uranium mining in Niger around 1970, following initial exploration that started in 1956. For decades, Niger provided 15 to 20% of France's nuclear fuel needs, producing over 2,000 metric tons of uranium annually at peak and accounting for approximately 5% of global uranium supply. The financial terms of Niger's uranium contracts reveal extraction at an almost colonial scale. Under contracts criticized by civil society organizations and international observers for their opacity and imbalance, Niger received royalties of only about 5.5% of market value. To contextualize this figure, in 2010, the two main Areva subsidiaries, Somer and Cominac, extracted uranium with an export value of 2.3 trillion CFA franc. Niger received only 300 billion CFA franc, a mere 13% of the exported value. But uranium, you see, isn't the only resource that matters here. AES countries have now moved to nationalize key industries like gold mines and water services previously managed by Western companies. This assertion of economic sovereignty challenges Western corporate interests and the established economic frameworks that have long governed resource extraction in the region. The Sahel sits atop critical mineral routes and future extraction zones tied to the global energy transition. Lithium, rare earths, transit corridors. Control of territory doesn't just mean control of land, it means control of future supply chains. And supply chains are where geopolitics is heading. Western officials often frame the AES as a proxy problem, Russia, China, foreign influence. But that explanation is incomplete, because the real threat to them isn't who replaces the West in the Sahel. It is the fact that the West can't be replaced at all. You see, for decades, African governments were told there was no alternative. No alternative to security partnerships, no alternative to financial systems, no alternative to political alignment. The AES now challenges that assumption, not by succeeding, but by trying. This is the part that doesn't show up in press releases. The most dangerous thing about the AES is not what it has done, it is what it makes imaginable. If three poor landlocked countries can leave ECOWAS, coordinate security, absorb sanctions, and survive, then others might ask the same question. What is integration for? Who does it serve? And at what cost? That is the fear. Not collapse, but contagion. By late 2025, Western rhetoric shifted. Travel restrictions, sharper intelligence assessments, warnings about instability. The language was now defensive, seeing that their monopoly was gone. The monopoly on legitimacy, on security frameworks, on development pathways. The AES wasn't just stepping out of a block now, it was stepping outside a system of expectations. And that was forbidding for African countries, not allowed to step out of line. In fact, the idea that African states can reject inherited systems and still stand is alien to Western powers. But that was what the AES chose. Now, I know you're wondering, what does this mean for Africa's future? By early 2026, the Alliance of Sahel States had survived its first test. The fact that it didn't immediately fail. Yeah, African breakaways are usually expected to follow a predictable pattern. First isolation, then economic collapse, and then political reversal. The AES disrupted that script, and that forced the world to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if this time is different? The truth is, the Alliance of Sahel States is not stable, not yet. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they remain among the poorest countries on earth. Yes, they face active insurgencies, weak institutions, fragile economies. They even have limited fiscal space. Leaving ECOWAS did not solve these problems entirely, not yet. In some cases, it made them harder. Trade costs rose, access to finance narrowed, diplomatic pressure intensified. This is the part critics focus on, and they are not wrong. The AES is walking a tightrope here, but fragility does not equal irrelevance. If the AES collapses, it will be familiar. Western policymakers already know how to manage failure. Sanctions will be justified, narratives will be reinforced, the status quo will be restored. But if the AES survives, even imperfectly, the consequences are far larger, because success here doesn't always mean prosperity, it means precedent. The precedent that exit from Western-backed system is possible. That coordination without asking for permission can actually work. That sovereignty is not purely symbolic, and once precedent exists, it spreads. Even without trying, the AES has already reshaped West Africa. ECOWAS no longer looks permanent. Its authority has been challenged, and openly. For neighboring states, this creates tension. Not because they want to leave, not yet, but because they know that the option now exists should they ever desire such. Once an option exists, loyalty changes. Negotiations become sharper. Compliance becomes conditional. Power becomes contested. Regional blocs are strongest when exit feels impossible. The AES made exit imaginable. And for Western powers, this presents a dilemma with no easy solution. Punish the AES too harshly and risk pushing it further away. Engage too softly and legitimize defiance. Sanctions may slow the alliance, but they also validate its narratives that sovereignty comes at a price, and that price is imposed externally. This is the bind. For decades, Western influence in Africa rested on a quiet assumption that there is no alternative. And while the AES is not an alternative yet, it is a challenge to that assumption. The question Western capitals are now asking is not how do we defeat the AES? It is rather how do we adapt to a world where alignment is no longer guaranteed. This is not a military contest. There will be no battlefield victory. What is at stake is influence, and influence is harder to reclaim once lost. The AES has emerged during a global shift. Power is dispersing, institutions are weakening, old hierarchies are being questioned. And in this environment, small states matter more because they test systems, they expose assumptions, they reveal where power is rigid and where it is fragile. The Sahel is now one of those testing grounds. The fear is not that Africa will fragment, but that it will finally get to choose partners, choose paths, choose risk over predictability. That is destabilizing to systems built on certainty. The AES doesn't need to expand to be influential, it only needs to persist. That persistence alone is troubling for Western powers. For generations shaped by colonial rule, structural adjustments, and externally designed reforms, the ability to say no carries something powerful. Even critics of the military governments understood that. This is why the AES is a threat to Western powers in Africa. The question these military rulers are asking is quite simple. If sovereignty always comes with risk, who gets to decide whether that risk is worth taking?